Hey, we've just gone live to Facebook.
Great.
Okay, thank you. Let me.
Thanks for the announcement. So, before we even begin introduction, so I'm Miss Sia Songwa, trans woman, also an activist and an ally to the Wits DRU. And I'd like to welcome everyone else that is watching this here. I believe that this event is really intended for the purpose of upholding the human rights of persons living with disabilities in South Africa. So as we have this conversation, feel free to chip in, ask questions. The panelists are here to really serve as a knowledge base for all of us to kind of, ponder and reflect on what we've come to understand of what disability is about and what human rights are about, but come to also reflect on what we can do to be active citizens, to be allies in our societies, right? So as we begin, I believe this is an opportune moment to start with the introductory segment. So South Africa is a country rich with vibrant history, which made significant strides in recognizing and protecting human rights. So with the entrenchment of human rights, enshrined in the bill, of course, and steadfast commitments to inclusivity, the nation has paved the way for safeguarding the rights of its citizens, especially those living with disabilities. So we delve into the historical context of South Africa and the human rights in this discussion, and we explore these foundations and how they can be implemented to support persons living with disabilities. South Africa has witnessed turbulent past, or rather a turbulent past, marked with the apartheid system and racial segregation, discrimination and oppression, and the apartheid era came to an end in 1994, when Nelson Mandela, an iconic anti-apartheid leader, became the first country's president who was Black, of course. And this historical milestone ushered in the era of hope and reconciliation and the desire to establish a more inclusive society where all individuals, regardless of race, gender, or disability, could enjoy equal rights and opportunities. So the Human Rights Bill, adopted in 1996, served as a turn point in South Africa's journey toward building a society that upholds the dignity and the equality of all its citizens. And this legislation firmly establishes the fundamental rights, such as the right to life, to equality, to freedom, to security for everyone in South Africa's borders. And it explicitly provides, or rather prohibits, discrimination on the basis of disability and outlines the responsibilities of the state toward the protection and the promotion of these rights. So with the commitment to inclusivity enshrined in the Human Rights Bill in South Africa, this has taken significant steps, rather, to address these needs for persons living with disabilities, and the country has ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons Living with Disabilities, demonstrating its intent to prioritize these rights and well-being of individuals with disabilities. One way South Africa has put this commitment into action is through its introduction of the Protection of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act. And this act protects persons living with disabilities, ensuring that they're not subjected to discrimination, and guarantees equal access to public services, facilities, and accommodation. Moreover, South Africa has established the South African Human Rights Commission, the SAHRC, an independent institution tasked with promoting the protection of human rights in the country. The SAHRC actively engages with marginalized and vulnerable groups, including persons living with disabilities, to ensure that their voices are heard in policymaking and decision-making processes. So in this practice, South Africa has implemented various inclusive policies and initiatives to support persons living with disabilities, and these include accessible infrastructure, inclusive education programs, affirmative action measures seeking to increase employment opportunities for individuals with disabilities. And furthermore, the government has established disability-specific institutions to provide specialized services and support for individuals with different abilities. So South Africa's journey toward inclusivity and equality and for all its citizens, including persons living with disabilities, is an ongoing process. And through the Human Rights Bill, the country's commitment to implementing inclusive policies, South Africa is taking concrete steps to removing barriers and ensuring that every individual's rights are protected and upheld. And the government, civil society, and international community must continue together to build the society where persons with disabilities can fully participate and contribute and thrive. So with that said, this is an opportune moment for every person that is here with us now, including interpreters, to introduce themselves. I am Miss Sia Shongwa. My pronouns are she and her. Let's see, who else? Who might I spotlight to be next to introduce themselves? Tish, would you like to introduce yourself? Your mic. Mike.
Hi there. My name is Mix Tish Morpheus Geddes. Use they, them pronouns. I am a person living with multiple disabilities and an activist. I'm based at Wits University in the Disability Rights Unit in the Transformation and Employment Equity Office. Good to be here today. Thank you.
Pure excellence. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, we do have next panelist. I'm going to start in-house. I might as well. Tulani Nkomo, do you mind doing the introductions for us? Pronoun, your designation, and all the good things.
Okay, thank you, Miss Sia. So my name is Tulani Nkomo. I'm a PhD candidate here at the university, at the Center for Critical Diversity Studies. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm interested in issues around disability, disability inclusion, higher education transformation. I just also probably, I don't know if it's the right time here to talk about why Wits Center for Diversity Studies, or there's
Yeah, you can.
Opportune
Yeah,
time. Okay,
so you can introduce the work that you do, but briefly.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Sia, for the opportunity. I'm just going to briefly touch on the kind of work that we do. So basically, we are an interdisciplinary center that works to interrupt dominant narratives about difference and otherness through knowledge creation and social intervention, providing an alternative interpretive lens through which diversity can be critically understood and sensitively engaged with to further the agenda of social justice and transformation. So disability is one of the other agendas of social redress and justice. We are also very much interested in disability plus other identity markers, race, gender, and sexuality. So thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Sia, for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for that. Tato, would you like to go up next and introduce yourself? Tato Mputi.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tato Mputi. Pronouns are she and her, and I am the founding director of an organization called Enabled Enlightenment. Our organization seeks to educate, to empower, to sensitize, and to change the outlook that people have on disabilities and to create social change and promote disability justice. I'm excited to be a part of this conversation and look forward to engaging with everyone on the call. Thank you.
Hey, Joel, would you like to go next? Are we there? Okay, I'm not getting any responses. Okay, but I mean, if there's anyone else that's obviously open to activating their mic and introducing themselves, feel free to do so at this moment before we continue on with the rest of the conversation. I'm obviously going to pose the questions very generally. And the idea here is that we're going to have an opportunity now for people that are participating in this panel discussion, and even people that are in the comment section, to feel free to reflect on some of the things that I mentioned. Feel free to add if you feel like there's a layer of the conversation that's not being explored. You can suggest that and highlight that as something to be pondered upon and also added to the conversation. And perhaps even, I would say, toward the question and answers section as well, you'll get a great opportunity as well to now start asking the panelists directly questions on some of the things that they share and reflect on within this section that we're starting now. I'm trying to see if there's anyone else. Okay, I don't. Okay, so we're good for the roster. So number one, I would say that this is really a question that affects everyone here in South Africa, especially people living in marginalized communities. But what causes people living with disabilities to be viewed as though they're not sexual beings, particularly as well as it applies to sexual reproductive health care services in South Africa? I will leave this as an open question, an open topic, I think, for all of us to discuss. But I mean, there are a lot of stereotypes that exist in society, and I do believe that these stereotypes end up being the benchmark, through which people apply their lenses of discrimination when it comes to healthcare services and even the implementation of these kinds of services in various spaces. And I would say that, people kind of understand people living with disabilities to be living with particular challenges that don't allow them particular privileges. But of course, this is definitely not, it does not necessarily hinder people from being able to be, natural beings practicing their own sexual orientation, sexual preferences, and so on. And definitely this is a platform where we can start to dispel some of these preconceived stereotypes and start to have more healthy perspectives in understanding what disability actually is. Okay, should I pick on someone, or Tajo?
Okay. I can go ahead. Thank you so much, Sia, for that question. So one of the main reasons that there's a belief that persons with disabilities are not sexual beings is the preconceived, notion that we have as different communities around what your role in society should be as a person with disabilities, right? How we are brought up, how we are socialized also plays a role in how we view individuals with disabilities. So people have the ideologies that as a person with a disability, you are constantly in need of help. There's the ideology that if you are to express any sexual desires or anything of that nature, then there's something wrong with you. Or if you are found having like sexual engagements or speaking about different sexual things, then there's an idea still there to say that maybe you are being taken advantage of, or you were exposed, to sexual violence, or you've been exposed to molestation because of your condition. But the reality is that as individuals with disabilities, it is imperative that we are also viewed as human beings first before we see and we view the disability. Because if we view persons with disabilities, then we would know and we would understand that they too are human, and on the basis of being human, they also have a right to sex and pleasure, right? And then because of this ableism and all of these many layers of discrimination that are within our different communities, they then put a hindrance to how we then get access to reproductive services, right? Outside of just the attitude of a healthcare provider when it comes to giving you services, you find things like the space is not accessible for me as a young Black woman with a disability to get services, right? My peers feel uncomfortable if I am in that space and I want to get contraceptives, because of this how we are brought up and how religion also plays a role in how, our bodies as women, it is worse if you're a woman with a disability, are being policed. So I just leave it there to allow the rest of the panelists to delve deeper.
Tato, that was an earful and really critical. I think just as a point of departure, I think you framed it really well as a foundation for our discussion to give us orientation on some of these preconceived notions and how they can impact negatively toward, people having access to sexual reproductive health services here in South Africa. Is it okay, Tulani, Tish?
Yes.
Would any of you like to add? Okay, let's start with you, Tulani.
Okay.
Then.
Okay,
would you
thank
like
you.
to add and reflect on that point?
Okay, thank you, Tato, for that. That was probably an encapsulation of some of the challenges that a lot of people face when it comes to disability and sexuality. In addition to that, I think also we need to also look at historically the movement of eugenics that tried to basically create a very a race which is without imperfection or some kind of unachievable race where people who are living with disabilities were denied or sterilized. So historically, there's this movement which has created certain kinds of understanding of people who are living with disabilities and how they interact with their sexuality. Also, in addition to that, there is also these attitudinal barriers that basically affect people living with disabilities, and we can see that, for instance, these kinds of attitudes are marginalizing people with disabilities, but in a more pervasive way. They affect women and other people in the minority group. So people living with disabilities, surely because of these infantilization, these so kind of discourses which talk about people living with disabilities as vulnerable, also exacerbate the idea that people living with disabilities are not sexual beings. And as we go further, there are some kinds of examples that will help to show that why these issues are basically in place. Yeah, that's what I could say just for now.
Thanks for adding on that. To be honest, there is a tendency to purport ableism. I think Tato touched on that, and you sort of continued on that momentum of highlighting how ableism is part of the problem. And I do think that these stereotypes must be eradicated. But as we continue to pass that baton of continuing to illuminate this room with more knowledge and more conversation, Tish, would you like to add to that and reflect on that first question around what causes people living with disabilities to be viewed as though they're not sexual beings, particularly when seeking sexual reproductive healthcare services in South Africa? Yeah.
Thanks, Sia. It's one of those fundamental questions that comes up again and again when we consider gatekeeping, when we consider how people with disabilities are viewed. And for me, working particularly with LGBTIQ plus people, one of the ongoing challenges is how asexuality is often conflated with disability and seen as a one. I want to just establish that asexuality in essence is very much specific to a person who doesn't experience any form of sexual attraction towards others. And in addition, when we talk about asexuality, we are talking about 1% of the population, which in essence is enough people to populate a small country. And by contrast, we talk about populations of people with disabilities. We're talking up to 10% of the population, depending on the specific disability. It's obvious when we consider these statistics of what the reality is. And I think that it's irresponsible of people who are offering sexual and reproductive health services to assume that this is a demographic that does not need the services that are being provided in accessible and you know, yeah, and accessible in ways, yeah.
Thank you for adding to that. So the following question is, I mean, I guess following on the heels of that question and adding more to that, can you please share examples of some of these myths and stigmas, as well as stereotypes that society generally holds when disabled persons request reproductive health care? Can we start again in the same rotation? Tato?
All right, so some of the myths and stigmas that exist is that as a person with disability, you can't have children, right? And I think it is layered. It is a layered conversation to have. I understand that there are certain conditions or certain kinds of disabilities that can limit you having children, right? But the attitude towards women with disabilities who can't access things such as reproductive services, they end up, being in, putting their lives in danger. And now they are pregnant. Society shuns them. And now that you have an unintended pregnancy on your hands, you can't even access things such as termination of pregnancy, which is yet another shame, that is put on you to say, how dare you even get to this point of, being pregnant. Another thing is a belief that if you are a person with a disability, it is imperative that you terminate that pregnancy, because if you dare give birth to the child, you will give birth to another child with a disability, and we do not need any more of children with disabilities in society, right? Which is flawed, which is problematic. And then there is also this belief that you do not have sexual feelings. You can't consent to sex. Whoever is having sex with you is taking advantage of you, right? Because you are vulnerable. And I'm not taking away the fact that as individuals with disabilities, there is a level of vulnerability that I think if people could change how they view us and how they engage with us, then they could start seeing things such as you are human first before you are your disability. And how we use language also impacts, or contributes to some of these myths and some of these stigmas that are attached to people with disabilities. For instance, in this conversation, we are addressing people with disabilities as people living with disabilities. So what does this mean? It means we are medicalizing disability, meaning we are only recognizing disability as something that comes, with a medical condition. What are we saying about people or children who are born with disability? Are we discrediting their experiences? So how we use language also perpetuates some of the stigmas and the myths that are there within society. And I think as we are moving forward with this conversation, can we just refrain from saying people living with disabilities, because we have ratified, as a country, the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We shouldn't even be using language like people living with disabilities, but using the person first language, meaning you recognize the person. So therefore you say persons with disabilities, right? And I think without taking too much space, I'll allow my colleagues to further engage us on the different myths and stigmas that are there in society.
Powerful contribution, Tato. Thank you so much for that. So persons living with disabilities, I think that's nice. Yes, it's a nice language interjection there as well for all of us to ponder on. But with that said, Thulani, would you like to expand on that as well? Just share on the examples of some of the myths and the stigmas, stereotypes that society generally holds.
Thank you, Tato, for that intervention. We see a lot of debates and politics around the naming, which words to use, people living with disabilities, people with disabilities. So thank you for that brilliant intervention. I just also wanted to add that some of the stigmas are associated with the idea that people with disabilities are incapable of having sex, you know, just or being in sexual relationships. The whole idea that they cannot do the deed, for me, is a misconception, because we do understand how there are so many dimensions of sexuality and how we can experience and do sex. So issues like people with disabilities. So an interesting idea is you'd find, for instance, when you go to these medical places that offer assistance, family planning and whatnot and whatnot. Some of the challenges that happen there is they might, yes, offer physical ramps for people with disabilities, but on the other hand, they are not offering materials that are, you know, they are not offering materials that could be understood by people living with disabilities. So for instance, there's no materials that talk to Braille, that are speaking for Braille. There are no materials that might speak to people with other intellectual disabilities. So this whole you know, stigma and attitudes continue, not necessarily in a vacuum, but they continue also towards the medical, where people actually go and access the sexual health and reproductive services. Yeah, I'll also leave it to I'll also leave for Tish to also add to this interesting discussion.
Tish, are you there?
Thanks, Tulani. I think that the previous speakers have made some excellent points. What I would like to add to that is to expand on the idea that people who have disabilities are individuals who are unable to experience the same kind of pleasure as able-bodied people. And one of the myths that was previously mentioned, the idea that people with disabilities don't experience pleasure, you know, this is an interesting one to unpack, because if we start looking into not only sexual and reproductive health services, but also just considering some of the things that contribute towards pleasure in consenting sex, we think about, you know, a very common option of sex toys. I'm seeing increasingly that there are online adult stores that are providing options of accessible toys that are easier to hold and use. You know, so I think it's really encouraging, reflecting on some of these barriers, that there are some gains being made. And I think these gains are critical in achieving a way forward, you know, that equalizes the space, that that corrects the power imbalances that we're seeing. So I just wanted to share that particular example. Certainly in my work, something that very much frustrates me is, you know, just taking the example of somebody who is visually impaired, walking across the university campus, you know, Disability Rights Unit will receive calls saying, how can you let somebody who's blind walk on their own? You know, how can you let somebody just walk unaccompanied around campus, not understanding that we put so much work into factors like mobility training, teaching our students how to access different parts of campus over and over again, to give them that independence. And the same, you know, very patronizing model is often applied when we talk about sexual and reproductive health. And this is not only a dangerous misperception, you know, but I think the previous speakers have alluded to the consequences of these ideologies, these myths, these stereotypes, and how at the end of the day we end up with very real problems that, you know, certainly go beyond medical spaces, not necessarily being accessible, but also go into the consulting rooms of our urologists, our gynecologists, and the services that we seek in those spaces that are really, not what we should be receiving. But certainly I would encourage anybody who is looking to break those myths and stereotypes to consult with online spaces if you are curious in learning about what kind of options are there for ensuring pleasure for people with disabilities and their partners. Thank you.
Thank you for that contribution, Tish. Just so many nuggets of knowledge and points to ponder coming from our panelists today. At the same time, we have to also take a moment to reflect on the amazing contribution of Sarah, our sign language interpreter, who's doing such a great job of keeping everyone abreast of the points that are being raised in this conversation, which is so critical. I believe that all of us should participate and this should be standardized in every conversation that is critical in our institutions. And with that said, the following question, it expands, on the previous question, and just asks panelists or everyone, I guess, to also ponder on what informs these ideas, these preconceived notions, stigmas, stereotypes, etc., that are held against persons with disabilities. What are these ideas basically, and what are the foundations of them? I believe that, all of us kind of have these learned habits. We have these learned notions that we live through, we live with, and we bring them into our workplaces. We bring them into our conversations, and we start to perpetuate them even in our policies, the ways in which we practice and live our lives. So some of them hold prejudice, some of them perpetuate stereotype, and where do we even begin to uncover these? But I mean, I would like to call to the panelists to start to unpack that question. What informs these ideas? Okay, shall I spotlight?
So no, can I just go ahead and probably speak to just what comes to mind? I think one of these challenges or situations that you talk about, I come to expect is the idea of heteronormativity, and the ideas of heterosexuality and all those associated terms. Those terms that look at the idea that we all need, there's either a male and female, and when we talk about heterosexuality, we talk about we need to be in relationships with the other, basically. So I think what basically happens is when we start to go further deeper down into these kinds of discourses and notions, we find out that it marginalizes already people living with disabilities as non-human, as people who do not fit in society, as people who are incapable of becoming the norm. So we therefore, in a way, erase their experiences, we erase the knowledge that they bring, and we erase basically their sexuality because people aren't aware, unsure, or they do not know how to comprehend these kinds of dynamics. So it's also very important for us to look at some of the normalized discourses out there around heterosexuality, heteronormativity, and start to unpack and challenge those discourses so that we can also bring people living with disabilities into the fore.
For sure. I do believe that these stereotypes are interlinked, the different ways in which stereotypes perpetuate marginalization and discrimination are interrelated and have the same kind of negative impact in terms of excluding our people and negatively impacting on the diversity that we need to see reflected in our society in terms of access to opportunity, access to healthcare, access to even just basic human rights. Tato, would you like to reflect on that and perhaps touch on anything else that you'd like to add?
So I believe that stigma is informed by the fact that we refuse, and I say refuse, understanding that it might make other people uncomfortable. But we refuse to recognize people with disabilities as human beings, people who are capable. So already just looking at that, you know that people will not treat you as an equal. You know, we continue not to view individuals with disabilities as people who are equals, people who can equally contribute, right? We minimize experiences of people with disabilities because we constantly want to make decisions on their behalf. Socialization, how we are brought up, plays a huge role in how, you know, stigma continues to grow or how discrimination even becomes. The ideologies around persons with disabilities just being charity cases, you know, so this speaks to a model of disability where we only view individuals with disabilities as, you know, people of charity, and not realizing that these individuals, you know, are powerful, you know, they can be empowered. And lastly, I think religion further perpetuate some of the stigmas, right? Because people believe that with religion, if you go into a religious space and you're a person with disability, the first thing they want to do, instead of welcoming you into the space, is to pray for you, right? Because there's this ideology that you need fixing. You are not okay, right? So therefore we need to fix you as the pastors, as whoever. So there are different structures really that inform the stigmas that exist. And I think we all collectively have a responsibility to play in, you know, debunking some of this, you know, stigmas and discrimination that exist. So I'll allow my fellow panelists to finish off.
Tato, thank you. Tish, would you like to add to that, expanding on the heels of what was shared by Tulani and Tato, just adding to, or rather reflecting on the point of what exactly are these sort of the foundation of these ideas that, you know, are preconceived notions that people might have. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think if we're going to interrogate where systemic oppression in the form of ableism has originated from, we only have to look back a few decades to understand just how serious the war on the bodies of people with disabilities has been to date. I mean, just examining some of the realities of living in Germany under Nazi rule, we can understand how people with disabilities were deliberately selected to be eliminated from the world that we exist in. And I think this absolutely goes back to eugenics. If we need a starting point to understand where this shame, this hatred, this prejudice, this erasure of people with disabilities had originated, we only have to talk, you know, to look back to eugenics movements. And in honesty, some of these eugenics movements are perpetuated today in sterilization, particularly of younger people with disabilities, often without their consent, sometimes without their informed knowledge. You know, it's a very difficult world to negotiate as a person with a disability, but absolutely we have the forefathers of, you know, those who pushed eugenics to thank for the mess that we find ourselves in our current times.
Thank you for that, Tish. So through your expertise, and this is another question to the panelists, what does research say about these myths that people hold? And does society assume, do they make assumptions through these stereotypes and so on, in terms of and how does this impact on reproductive healthcare services in terms of access? So, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to what research says. I believe that personal experience and also professional experience probably does have some relevant insights to give to this conversation, and also to the ongoing work that will come from the knowledge generated from this conversation. So what is your insight on that? Second question. I see there are a couple of comments that have popped up as well. We've got Dr. Ntlotling Mabena, who says, very interesting insights shared by panelists. Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel, okay, I guess I'll reflect on that question during the Q&A session. A second question as well, I'll definitely reflect on that. At the moment, we're just going to continue with the rest of these and then come back to your questions, Doctor. But thank you for your participation. Tulani, can I pull on you to reflect on that? Just saying,
Okay.
anything that you know of that's been shared in research, your experience. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot of literature, a lot of growing literature per se on the idea of disability and the intersection with sexuality. But in terms of your question, you basically are saying what kind of the myths, right? That what is the research saying about people? Look, so there is growing research of people with disabilities who are doing research on sexuality. But I must also say to you, there is also what our former colleague, may his soul rest in peace, Dr. Chappell, talks about disabled normativities as well, in continuation with the heteronormativity and all those binaries. He talks about, basically there's a lot, the research is more centered on physical disabilities and people having and pleasure there. Yet there is little research that talks about people with disabilities who are in the LGBTI community, and he guards us against, just, following these Western Eurocentric ideas of just research. But what's also very interesting is, on the other hand, there is this whole movement to asexualize people with disabilities. Whilst on the other hand, also, this is what research is talking about, is when it comes to people, specifically women living with intellectual disabilities, they are hypersexualized on the other hand. So it creates this unequal knowledge vacuum where we actually unsure whether people with disabilities, or the conception that people with disabilities, or it continues and concretizes the whole notion that people with disabilities are not having sex. So the research is quite very interesting in how it branches out. So it's quite important that we really, in an essence, try and dismantle these kinds of knowledge production systems by actually engaging with people living with disabilities themselves, so that we can actually gain a much more grounded perspective. Because if we keep on relying on some of these assumptions and prejudices, people living with disabilities continue to be raised from sexuality, raised from any knowledge production around sexuality. Thank you.
Okay, is anyone else, Tato, Tish, willing to also contribute to that in terms of reflecting on what the science has to say, some of the researchers and discourses?
Yes, absolutely. So there is a researcher in disability studies, Brian Watermeyer, and of Watermere, who's based at US, is quite well versed when elections between disability and the negotiation of power in different spaces. So one of his observations. So one of his observations, which I've found to be absolutely fascinating, is around, you know, what motivates hatred towards people with disabilities. And you know, his theory going into space. I mean, I can give an example. About a decade ago, in a Japanese institution for people with disabilities, there was a hate crime where people had come, you know, begun murdering people who were resistant. And Watermere would argue that whenever somebody who has a disability, the complexity that comes to the surface is that that person who is able-bodied starts to unconsciously interrogate what their life would be like living with that disability. And that discomfort, you know, that interrogation of their own biases is often something that, you know, preludes hatred, discrimination, mistrust. And in my specific example, unfortunately, sometimes it goes to the extremes. I think Watermere has done some amazing research in this field, but certainly I echo Tulani in that there is no unparalleled South African researcher that we can really, you know, compare to Paul Chappell. May he rest in peace.
Sarah, I'm trying to see, is Sarah back yet? We seem to have lost Sarah, and Sarah is making such a valuable contribution to this conversation. Tato, I'm gonna have to ask you to just hold on for a second. I don't know
I'm
why
trying to get our
happened.
Cecily back online.
Yes. Okay, Tato, I think you can maybe, yeah, just share your reflection as well while we wait for Sarah to come back.
Maybe can I make a recommendation that you have closed captions on, so that those who are depending on the translation are still able to see the captions, so they are not left behind in the conversation.
That's a very good idea.
Right?
Thank you so much for.
So with that being said, I think
Yes.
my thoughts around the research is that a lot of the research that is done it does not center experiences of people with disabilities. It has a Eurocentric approach, which I find to be problematic, because then how does it then connect to a lived experience of Tato who lives in rural Mdantsane, as an example? So that has really been just my
not to interrupt you, but yeah, not to interrupt you, but also please reflect on some of your own work experiences, or like professionally in your work, and how you found some of these to have reflected upon you and your knowledge and understanding. Yeah.
Yes, I'm coming to it. I was just making a reflection on how I feel on the current data that we have, to say it does not fully represent who we are as persons with disability, because it does not center our lived experiences. And I think another thing that we need to take to heart or to take into consideration is the fact that as individuals with disabilities, we are living intersectional lives. You know, so the fact that I am young, Black, have a disability, I am queer, I am unemployed, I do not have a level of education, you know, so research needs to speak to the different, you know, lenses or the different levels of our lived experiences as persons with disabilities. So that is where the disconnect is for me currently, in as far as research is concerned. And I think I also want to speak on people without disabilities have their own challenges when it comes to sex and pleasure. They haven't figured it out for themselves. So being a person with a disability who understands their sexuality, number one, who understands what pleasure looks like for them, who can communicate what pleasure should be for them, then creates that disconnect between us and them. Right. So we also need to be cognizant of that. I mean, if people haven't figured it out for themselves now, and you are here, you have a disability and you have figured it out for yourself, then it creates, you know, that's another layer of stigma to say, you know too much, or, you know, and I think there is a woman that I love from Cape Town. I just forgot her name. And she speaks on pleasure and experience. She centers, you know, experiences of people with disabilities as a person with a disability. I think for me, the issue is in there are all these other people wanting to tell our story, right? And in them telling our stories, it will not be factual because then it does not have that connect to it. And I think there is an episode that we did on sex and pleasure that aired on Showmax, and it is persons with disabilities across the board. It recognizes people with Down syndrome and what does sex and pleasure look like for them. People who are within the LGBTI community. So it has an intersectional approach. That is what we need in research, for us to be represented, even in those spaces of research, for us to have factual data, or for us to have data that speaks to us across the intersections that we live in as individuals with disabilities.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that contribution. Whew, wow, that was a mouthful. A lot of points to ponder on there.
And Sia,
so yes, are you there?
Can I say also something?
Okay.
Sorry, my camera. I don't know what it does with the network. I think yeah. But I also just wanted to say, I think it's also interesting in relation now that in relation to my study, I'm interested in men living with disabilities, African men living with disabilities, and how they interact, or how they make sense of their disability. And what's interesting in that is I'm also picking up a lot of research on how also because people with disabilities have been asexualized, there is a lacuna in research on how men living with disabilities actually experience gender-based violence or perpetrate gender-based violence. So it's quite interesting in terms of how it then opens up new avenues to understand how disability and sex and sexuality interact and intersect. Thank you.
That is such a powerful point to add to the conversation as well. I believe that Tato did allude to some of those points a little bit earlier, but you know, I love how you framed it now as well, adding some dimensions to it of interest. But with that said, why is it dangerous for society to hold on to these myths? And how can we start to work to change these perceptions? Who'd like to go? And I forgot to welcome. Should I elect someone? Can I put you under pressure there to add to that? Why is it dangerous for society to hold on to all of these myths? And what can we do to change these outdated views?
It looks like Sia has froze, but did they specifically say I should continue? If so, then I would just say that I think it's very dangerous for society to continuously hold on to these myths, because there is a lot that we don't know about disability and sexuality. Like I've alluded, in terms of gender-based violence, we are currently under this pandemic of gender-based violence, and it's also important for us to understand how people with disabilities are experiencing gender-based violence. And also to probably add, it's also, and I know Maria out there likes the word consent so much because she preached a lot about consent, but it's also very important, because for us to understand the idea of consent, specifically around people living with mental and intellectual disabilities, the idea of consent becomes also very important, because as we have seen how dangerous the concept of non-consent tends to lead into. So the more we know about how disability and people with disability engage with sex and sexuality and experiences of pleasure, it gives us opportunities to understand how also consent is also, experienced within people living with disabilities. I will just let also my colleagues add to that.
For sure. Anyone else like to chip in on that one?
I think that when we are considering the consequences of ableism and the exclusion of people with disabilities from healthcare spaces, from decision making around their own reproductive health, and certainly around these life-saving services that are pushed upon cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied people, there is a parallel to draw here. I mean, certainly in my work with populations of transgender people, there's consistently this question that comes up: where can I find somebody who is trans-friendly, who's a gynecologist, somebody who's a urologist? How do I access services from somebody who's not going to be prejudiced based on my transition journey, based on what my body may or may not look like, and based on the choices I've made for, my transition journey. And the implications of that are people not doing their routine health checks, that very realistically exist to curtail our rates of cancer and their impact on every generation in terms of the unnecessary deaths that are caused. All it takes is a list of trans affirming sexual and reproductive health professionals to completely change the dynamic and start a group of transgender people actually reaching out and getting the services they need. And the same, I feel, is cross-applicable to communities of people with disabilities and those who live with those intersections, you know, such as myself as somebody who is transgender, as well as, you know, living with multiple disabilities. You know, those parallels are very clear for me. But as we delve into the intersectionality that exists between these identities and lived experiences, what emerges for me that is absolutely critical is the consequence of gaslighting people who are in need of sexual and reproductive health care, gaslighting survivors of GBV, as Tulani has spoken to, and certainly gatekeeping of these services to people who really, really need them. The consequences are absolutely the same as, you know, what we're arguing for when our able-bodied, particularly cisgender and heterosexual populations don't access their routine screening. And that's just, you know, the tip of the iceberg for me. When we start talking about survivors of GBV, certainly, you know, talking specifically about queer survivors of GBV and how often we see that colliding with not only the first form of oppression of, you know, prejudice on the basis of gender, sexual orientation or such. But when you add that to an equation that is already unbalanced, and somebody who is a survivor of GBV seeks legal support, they seek psychosocial support, etc., we so often see the dynamic of secondary victimization come into the picture. And to be honest with you, it is a mess. It's a mess that we are still seeing this, you know, this far into, you know, our journey as global participants and global citizens, seeing this, you know, as a cycle that is recycled across the world. And ultimately, I sit with the question of, you know, in spaces where we have the resources to do so, why is it not a state of urgency for us to do better?
This is exactly why Tish works within the DRU. Can you hear me? Am I audible? Okay, maybe I should make a quick shift. Okay. Okay, I've had to shift to my mobile Wi-Fi. I believe it'll be more stable, hopefully. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect.
Yes.
But yeah, reflecting on that statement, though, that you know, the prioritization of number one, destigmatizing and creating those awareness programs and I would even call them leadership development initiatives are so critical to every workspace to ensure that people don't hold these stigmas and use them in their practices, whether as medical practitioners and doctors or staff members of any institution or even students of any learning institution, so to speak, as well, and learners. But with that said, does anyone else in the panel want to expand on any of those points? Or should we move to the next one?
So I apologize, I got disconnected. So I think what I would like to speak on is the importance of decolonization, right? As a disability rights movement, we need to be intentional about decolonizing the space. We saw that some of these methodologies and some of these things are not working for us. And there needs to be a will from whether it's the Ministry of Health, whether it's the healthcare providers themselves, to learn and learn and relearn ways of integrating persons with disabilities within their healthcare space. If it means that there needs to be a committee that is focusing on how do we create inclusive services, or how do we have spaces that are inclusive for persons with disabilities to be able to access these different services, that's what we need to do, right? And I think it is important that for individuals with disabilities who go into the different health facilities, they should be capacitated, right, on how to report some of these injustices that happen within the healthcare facilities, from discrimination to ableism and all other injustices that we find within the healthcare space. So healthcare providers should stick to the Batupili principle and ensure that young women and girls wanting to receive reproductive services are prioritized, right? And it's not just about the ramp that needs to be there, but it's about an intention to have inclusive spaces where young people with disabilities know that if I go to this facility, I am welcome in this space. And also, fund us like you want us to win, right? I mean, it's important that we are funded to do the work of educating healthcare providers as well, right? Because clearly money for training, it's not being utilized in such a way that these facility managers, these healthcare providers are at a point where they are ready to receive individuals with disabilities. Therefore, now fund organizations that are focusing on disability justice to do the work, because clearly there's a disconnect. The work is not being done, or if it's being done, it obviously is not done using the disability lens.
Critical reflection, important to the conversation, for sure. Is there any other contribution there, Tulani?
Yes. I also just wanted to add on and say, also, Tato, create accessible learning guidelines, accessible materials where people with disabilities can actually, actually get information about their health, about their reproductive rights and everything like that. So yeah, that's also something I just also wanted to add.
That's such a powerful idea as well. Definitely. It sounds like something that's very doable as a venture. But with that said, the following question is just a hypothetical question. Say a parent or caregiver looking after a child would receive information regarding, or rather denies their child information around contraception and comprehensive sexuality education. How do we make the parent see, or the caregiver see, that the child deserves to receive this kind of education? And this is quite a concern. I mean, there does seem to be a tendency among society to have these inbuilt stereotypes around sexual reproductive health. And some parents do want to block this kind of education, suggesting that somehow that some children are either too young, or it's against their beliefs, their traditions, their culture. And at the end of the day, we must also respect the rights of the child. What if the child as well happens to find themselves in a position where they need to use this knowledge? And so this conversation must be had, and we must unpack these concepts.
Thank you so much, Sia, for that question. I think this speaks to the work that we do with caregivers and parents of children with disabilities. It's just really about supporting them. But also one thing that we also need to remember is that there is no parenting manual, right? And parents therefore become the biggest barriers to young people accessing some of the services, because one, it is very uncomfortable for parents to speak to their children without disabilities about sex education. In the African context, you can't even say sex, you can't say vagina, you can't say penis, right? Because then it means that you are a problematic child, this and that. But what we do is that in our programming, we have incorporated the comprehensive sexuality education curriculum to support parents and just have a conversation with them, because we understand that parents did not have, their parents didn't sit down with them, to prepare them. It was a trial and error kind of thing, for some of their parents to say, oh, actually, I knew about reproductive because now I was pregnant, or, so we also make use of the curriculum from Amaze. So Amaze is an international project, and is IBIS Reproductive Health is heading it. So we also make use of those tools that Amaze provides. We use animation, right? There are workbooks and information that is available. So I think it has also taken the burden off us, and just showing, parents that, when you introduce your children to comprehensive sexuality education, you are delaying like sexual debuts. It helps in us delaying sexual debuts, from young people. Young people have a sense of bodily autonomy. And the beauty of it is, if a parent is empowered and a parent understands what comprehensive sexuality education, they just, pass down, the information to their children with kindness, and they do not use fear. And that is something that I've picked up, especially in the sexual and reproductive health programming that we use, especially working with adolescent girls and young women, is that we use a fear-centered approach where if you play with a boy, you will fall pregnant. It is just really about, educating parents to say, hey, that's not the language we use. Because if you instill fear on your child, chances are they will want to go and see. But using also the pleasure lens to say, what is your relationship with your body? Do you even know what your vagina looks like? Do you know what your penis looks like? Are we even able to name our body parts, or are we just going to leave it, to someone else to all start to do it, in the groups, in the group sessions, so having had that, where we bring in the parents, using the different curriculums, has changed how parents also have relationships with their own bodies, where you hear someone say, I think in my whole life, it's only now that I've understood what an orgasm is, right? So it just goes on to show the power of using information, and engaging people, meeting people where they are, right? Because we don't want to go into the space and you are just, bombarding them. So I'll just leave it there and allow the rest of the panelists to share what their experiences are.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Always valuable nuggets of information reflected there by our panelists. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yes. Thank you, Tato, for that. I think we need to sit down and have a cup of coffee and discuss some other new ways we could. So we could also move this work forward. So also part of our work ideally is research, and so we did a research project specifically designed to understand the misconceptions around disability and sexuality. So we really went out there, did a research project, and what culminated out of the research project was a manual for caregivers. So we went on and developed a manual that we thought this is also knowledge that caregivers should also understand, also be aware of, because there's a lot that needs to be said, and there's a lot that needs to be done regarding sexuality, specifically around when it intersects with disability. So we are also trying to do this kind of work. Unfortunately, we are a small department, and we don't have the manpower and the capacity, but we will be interested in partnering with people like you, Tato, and anybody else out there in actualizing these kinds of materials, so that also not just the parents, but also the caregivers are also brought into the loop, into understanding that this is a quite an urgent and important matter to have. Thank you, Sia.
So valuable, and indeed such guidelines are needed. I mean, in the work that we've been engaged in, I mean, I was recently invited by the Transformation Office to conduct a workshop on diversity around persons living, or rather persons with disabilities, and SOGIESC at the Tshwane University of Technology. And this was just a year ago, and we're doing it again this year. And we keep finding the same recurrence, really, when there are no policies in place. It's difficult for people to actually actualize these ambitions of doing away with these stigmas, and teaching people about a different institutional culture, or a different community-based kind of culture as well, that could be introduced by even the leaders and persons rather, who feel that they're being ostracized, and I believe that such guidelines are critical. We do need to create these kinds of knowledge sources, databases that could be implemented by our communities to make these kind of positive changes. Here we're speaking about, doing away with these stigmas and breaking down the barriers that are keeping our communities marginalized and excluded from participating actively in our communities, in our educational institutions, and general society at large. But with that said, I'm humbled to have participated in this conversation. But before we even imagine moving away from the conversation, we have to unpack some of the suggestions that were suggested in the comments section. Perhaps if there are any questions, this is the opportune moment for anyone who would like to ask any. Please share those with us. I can't seem to see the doctor's questions from previously. I believe it's because I got disconnected at some point.
I can read those out for you if that's okay. So Dr. Ntleng asks, how should we engage persons with disabilities on issues relating to experiences of violence, particularly sexual violence, and needed conversations around power, I think power dynamics, and intimate partner violence, particularly when there is a person with disability in the relationship? I think I'll let the panelists answer this question, and then I'll read the second question afterwards.
Okay, I would like to respond to that. Tulani, can I put you on the spot?
Okay. So I can see the question. So I would say probably, and this is me talking from my kind of research, and how when I do this kind of research with men with disabilities, I'm not necessarily trying to look at the sexual violence aspect, but the research that I'm coming across looks at, it's very important that we get to understand also the men's perspective, because also because of the propensity for men to commit sexual violence or intimate partner violence after they've acquired the disease, or because of the pressures of society. I know there's a whole lot of, or as I'd mentioned before, GPV going around, and And this study that one of my other colleagues from the Medical Health Research Council did around men, it was a tri-national study, Uganda, South Africa, and I'm not sure the last country. But what the men there were talking about were that the pressure to be a man sometimes forces them to commit some of these kinds of offenses. So we are now also looking at disabled men as perpetrating violence, not just as people who are passive individuals in their lives. So those conversations are also important. But on the other hand, when they interviewed people from South Africa, some because I liked the issue that Tato raised about intersectionality of identities. Some of the people talk about when you are Zulu, and these are the participants speaking like from the interview, that as a Zulu man, there's no violence that can happen on you. So they are in a way suggesting that any kind of violence that is perpetrated on them, whether it's sexual or either by the partner, is not violence. And that kind of understanding, for me, shifts the whole understanding of how violence is perpetrated and who is perpetrating the violence. So to answer your question, I think we need to start particularly opening up conversations with people with disabilities involved as the people sharing their experiences, and also try to maybe in research terms try and look at other ways of collecting knowledge which is not preemptive, like how the medical model relies on you have the problem. Maybe try and look at indigenous kinds of knowledge, you know, like how we used to deal and live with people with disabilities. I think also Tato touched that in terms of decolonizing disability, we also need to go back and instead of looking from the top bottom, like doing the research in a pyramid form, we need to also start from the bottom up. I think that is how we can, you know, start having these kinds of conversations and understanding how violence is perpetrated or how violence also circulates around those kinds of situations. I think I tried.
I'd like to add to what Tulani shared, if I may.
Yes.
I absolutely relate to the phrase, nothing about us without us. And it is simplistic in nature, but for me, it makes an important point. If we are having conversations about GBV, about human rights violations around sexual and reproductive health, and we want to include people with disabilities in these conversations, there are very fundamental things that we need to get right. And the first is access to these conversations. You know, we've had two amazing SASL interpreters join us today who I'm very grateful for in their time here today. Without their presence, you know, members of the deaf community would not be able to participate in today's panel discussion, and you know, nor would they be able to have access to this conversation. And I mean, in addition to that, all the marketing material that we've sent out has been screen reader accessible. It's also we've marketed this event on social media. And in addition to that, we have engaged different staff, students in our context and in the context of our stakeholders who put this event together to ensure that from every perspective, we've created an inclusive event. Now, to have these conversations beyond events like this, it is critical to resource them appropriately. We need SASL interpreters. We need to have material that is available in accessible formats. So if you are going to be disseminating training material, if you're going to be accessible to people who have print impaired disabilities, people who have visual disabilities, people with learning disabilities, we need to broaden this conversation and ensure that, in as much as possible, we've created a space that everybody can join on their terms. I mean, I think as a departure point, what is quite critical when we are particularly engaging on this topic, and I mean, the doctor who asked this question speaks directly to some very, very difficult issues. It's also to consider the effects of trauma on multiple generations of people with disabilities who have experienced the unfortunate intersections of their identities with GBV. And that is the use of trigger warnings, engaging with populations in a way that you make sure that you're not re-traumatizing or perpetuating conversations that are unhealthy in nature. And if we can't get those things right, then we cannot call our spaces inclusive. Thanks.
Thank you for that reflection, Tish. And also, we've got a comment from Sesona, who says this week the president officially signed off making SASL the 12th official language. What will impact this milestone to make, for the making of SRH more accessible to persons with disabilities? Wow. And I think that's such a critical, that's such a critical milestone for us as a country, because it means that obviously more resources can be put into these platforms and ensuring that we get the resources we need. If it's an official language, therefore adequate infrastructure as far as siphoning resources and building infrastructure for the purpose of supporting, the inclusion of that language as the 12th language will be used. And that's a win for all of us in terms of getting more, more inclusion and more intentionality about making sure everyone that's in the room participates and gets to actively be a part of these conversations. Are there any other questions? Is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to participate in the conversation, asking any closing questions to the panelists? Otherwise, I would like to just request some closing remarks.
Yes, so the doctor still had a second question, which was, we obviously have a very long way to go in making issues of persons with disabilities more visible and more responsive systems. My question is, how do we also ensure that in these conversations, we also bring forward issues relating to people with silent disabilities, such as issues relating to neurodivergent persons, persons with mental health conditions, etc.?
That's a critical question, for sure. Would any of the panelists like to expand on that and delve on that question? Sato?
All right, so thank you so much, Sia, and thank you, Sasona, for rereading that question. I think maybe not one, but something that we need to do is people who do not have disabilities should be that are intentional about being allies to the movement of disability rights. And I say this because I know and I understand that, a voice of a person without a disability is much louder than the voice of a person with a disability. So I think it's really just about integration and recognizing our privileges, right, as different individuals, and using our privilege to be advocates of inclusion and being, being intentional about how we also do programming. I think if the intent is there and the intent is clear, then we will have a seamless, process where inclusion is not just something that we are doing to tick boxes, but inclusion becomes who we are. Inclusion becomes the programs that we implement, right? And we know that no one will be left behind. And I think also to admit that we don't have it all figured out, right? And with that being said, let us have room and space for consultation, for engaging individuals with the different disabilities to say, how do we create this inclusion that we are speaking about? Or how do we, bring about the change, especially with disabilities that are unseen, because also, society has this thing of saying, just because we don't physically see, or we don't see your disability with the naked eye, then therefore we minimize your experience yet again. So I think just also adding that element or that layer of consultation can help us in achieving, intentional inclusion.
Thank you for that contribution, Tato. Tulani, would you like to sign off on that response?
Thank you, Tato. Yeah, and also probably, sometimes we also need not to focus on the, like Tato said, the physical disability, where the wheelchair becomes the symbol of only disability that we know. So we also need people with neurodivergent disabilities, mental health conditions, also being part of the conversation. If that looks like asking for assent from their caregivers, we also need to also ensure that the caregivers understand what we are trying to do with these kinds of conversations. Yeah, like Paul says, we shouldn't also allow this disabled normativity to take hold in our responses towards affirming people with disabilities.
Thank you for that, Tulani. Tish, would you like to reflect on the doctor's question as well?
Certainly. I mean, from my personal perspective, of the multiple disabilities that I experience, the vast majority of them are invisible. I mean, if you look at me, it's easy to assume that I'm somebody who is able-bodied until, perhaps I turn, you can see my hearing implants, or, you see me trying to navigate a built space with the mobility disabilities that I experience. And it is absolutely a frustrating reality. And I echo what Tulani has shared, that, the visible disabilities are not the only disabilities. And that I feel there's far more stigma that comes with having an invisible disability. The struggles you may experience are not visible struggles. And I think this is particularly true when we talk about the neurodivergence that the doctor was referring to. I mean, ultimately, going forward, I think that we have to be very careful not to assume. In the work that we do, particularly in the Safe Zones at Wits program, I mean, Sia will be able to attest that something that we teach the people who do the training is, if you don't know what somebody's pronouns are, use gender neutral pronouns. And we do this for a reason, because we don't want to assume. And similarly, if we transpose that kind of expectation, towards people who have disabilities, who we might see walking into spaces like the disability rights units. I'm never, in my role as a administrative assistant in the space, going to assume that, because I can't visually recognize any form of disability, that this person who's with me now is necessarily in a space because they're perhaps fabricating things, making things up, trying to take chances. I realize that it can be very difficult to try and articulate a disability that other people can't see. And for that reason, I think that, as I've touched on in my previous point, accessibility is important, but beyond that, it's important to not assume. So I think that transposing the kind of experience that people like myself and Sia, and also Tulani, who is another one of our trainers, take into account, is that if there is somebody who is in your spaces, it's safe to assume that, many of the people that we engage with in our world may have disabilities that we are not aware of and sit with the invisible stigma of those disabilities. And we need to break from that by having these conversations and by moving from the assumption that disabilities are solely visible. In doing so, we empower people who, like myself, are able to join these platforms and talk about our invisible disabilities. And to be honest, that is everything. Thank you.
Thank you for that reflection, Tish. We have another comment from the doctor just responding, saying thank you very much for all the responses. Looking forward to engaging further with everyone. This was really useful and progressive. That's Dr. Ntlo Tleng Mabena in the comments. Okay, but with that said, I just wanted to thank you to everyone who has participated in this conversation. To be honest, I didn't think that it would take as long as we did, but hopefully it was an earful and also enough knowledge to make us all think and reflect on how we, even in our own individual responsibilities and our work that we do, we can find ways to be allies, to be awareness creators and givers, in a world where it's okay to be ignorant. But I believe that, in a real, authentic, democratic South Africa, and even in a world where, we are all real human beings who see and respect each other, that it's important that we take this work seriously and we take these moments to reflect on how we can use this knowledge going forward, that these conversations don't become these silo once-off events, but they empower us in the work that we do to continue to shine a light of positive change making. Thank you again. I'd like to thank all the panelists. And I guess in closing, I'd like to just give each panelist a minute to just close for us, and then we depart for the rest of this afternoon. Tulani, would you like to open? It looks like you're the only person who's poised.
Okay. Thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. And thank you, Sia, for the lovely facilitation. Thank you to our fantastic sign language interpreters and and anyone who joined, even though we couldn't see them from Facebook. So thank you so much. I just also wanted to say you should visit us at Wickets. We're located at the Sakia Mphahlele building, which formerly University Corner, 13th floor. We do a lot of work on diversity, critical work on diversity, not just diversity, but yeah. So I would like to, thank you everyone for participating here, and thank you, Sia. That's all.
Sorry about that. Tish, would you like to
You
give us
speak
one?
on
Yeah, would you like to give us 1 minute of closing statements?
Absolutely. Working in higher education for me is quite a profoundly moving experience on, my everyday working reality. And absolutely, we have these conversations, we have these considerations, and we interrogate the world that we exist in because we want to make things better for the generations to come. Thank you very much to the organizers. Thank you very much to yourself, Sia, for being a brilliant facilitator as always. To the other panelists, and certainly the SASLI who have joined us. Also to our own colleagues, many of whom have joined the conversation today. You're all very much appreciated, and absolutely, we are doing this for the next generation.
Did we manage to get Tato back just to give us some closing remarks? Tato?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sia, and to everyone who joined us in this conversation. And I hope that it was a learning experience for all of us. Excuse me. So in closing, I just want to say that, or maybe just remind us that when barriers are removed, women and girls with disabilities then have freedom and can make choices over their lives and over their bodies. So let's continue creating the influence and creating and bringing about positive change. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. And I'm hoping that after this conversation that the channels of communication will be open for collaborations, for more discussions such as this. Please feel free to get in touch with the DRU through Tish, Mixed Tish Louis Moss, obviously to partner, to speak about perhaps any consultations that are necessary around similar topics or projects going forward. But thank you so much for your participation, and have an amazing weekend going forward. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.